Hi everyone, this is Mark Fox, CEO of NetEvents. Delighted to welcome all the international press to this event today on demystifying cloud-native networking. Chairing this session, we have Brad Casemore, who you've met before in a couple of our sessions. So Brad is the Vice President of Research for Datacenter and Multicloud Networking at IDC. Brad, welcome, and over to you.
Thanks very much, Mark. It's a pleasure for me to be here today, and I look forward to a lively and informative discussion with our panelists on the topic of demystifying cloud-native networking. With us today, we have Thomas Graf, who is the co-founder and CTO of Isovalent. We also have Galeal Zino, who is the co-founder and CEO of NetFoundry. And we also have Pere Monclus, who is the VP and CTO of networking at VMware. And I look forward to this discussion. These gentlemen who are with us today are extremely well-versed in the topic we'll be addressing, and they've spent a great number of years and considerable effort in this space. So with that, I want to queue up the discussion with just a few slides before we get into a great chat with our panelists. One thing that we all know is happening, of course, is the rise of cloud-native application architectures. We know that these are built on loosely coupled microservices using containers, and we know that they're orchestrated with Kubernetes. And we know certainly from IDC research that more and more workloads will be modern applications leveraging these technologies. There will be a growing wave of them over the next few years. Perhaps what is less understood are the implications for networking and connectivity, which obviously has to support these environments. What we've learned, of course, from some enterprises who are going through this cycle is that they should not assume necessarily that they have a network that is fit for purpose when it comes to cloud-native application environments and supporting the needs of developers and DevOps teams. Networking for these environments, these cloud-native environments orchestrated by Kubernetes, can be complex and it can be difficult. And there are some significant differences. Some people say, well, networking is networking, and that's true up to a point, but there are some notable differences from the traditional networking assumptions and constructs that we use, or that we have used hitherto. And these are worth noting because Kubernetes has specific network requirements, as does the cloud-native architectures, and they must be addressed. And many of them are beyond the scope of the traditional network infrastructure. Now, you may ask, what do I mean by that? Well, we certainly see that as we move forward into these modern application architectures using containers and microservices, that there is a greater degree of perceived and real value at the higher end of the stack. So it's not to say that what you're doing down at layer 2 and layer 3, where you have switching and routing technologies is unimportant. You absolutely have to make sure that you have the right plugins and methodologies there. But increasingly, it becomes more about how you connect, support, have visibility into, and be able to basically observe what's happening up at layer 7, which is the application layer. And that's where microservices, of course, connect to one another and how they scale in these environments. So it's very important to understand how the network needs to be adapted to meet Kubernetes requirements. And depending on your application environment, where you are today and what sort of infrastructure you have in place today and the technology investments you've made and your operational models and your resources, right, in terms of skill sets, the organization will have several options in terms of how you move forward and support Kubernetes. So the good news, the bad news is it's complex. The good news is there are ways to move forward, and we're going to discuss them today on this panel. So if we move to the next slide, I want to just explain at the outset, why it matters. I think we touched on it in the last slide, but containers are obviously changing how applications are developed, but they're also changing how applications connect to each other and perform on the network. Most of the container focus, as I indicated in the last slide, has been on orchestration, and that's completely understandable given its importance to application developers. But the network and connectivity is also critical for these production deployments. because the network has to have, they call it cloud native, and it has to have cloud native attributes. It has to be intelligently automated. It needs to be elastically scalable, and it needs to be secure, including security for the workloads. And there's a greater need in this environment than ever before to have that sort of visibility and observability because of the dynamism and the ephemeral nature of containers. Now, while Kubernetes abstracts complexity from application developers, and it provides a plugin interface that allows them to work without distractions and focus on their business workloads rather than having to focus on the infrastructure and managing it, and developers generally don't like to do that, the complexity is moved to the operations team. So they have to deal with these issues. And these are DevOps teams, these are platform teams, et cetera. And they have to ensure that the network infrastructure performs to expectations, performs to the expectations of the developers, and supports the business objectives and the application requirements. Without the proper networking functionality in place and the support for all the key attributes and requirements, these cloud native deployments and Kubernetes environments will fall short of their goals. And that's why the networking is so important. It's sometimes, I don't want to say that it's a forgotten resource, but it certainly can sometimes be underappreciated in these environments. And what we're trying to do here is bring that appreciation to the forefront. And then on the final slide, I think before we queue it up for a discussion, there are many things you have to keep in mind. As I said, this is a full stack phenomenon. More and more of the value and I think the richer capabilities are moving up the stack and principally to layer 7, which of course is the application layer. And in a container construct, that's where microservices communicate with one another. But you also need to consider where you're going with this environment. Do you need to ensure that as you move forward, you have multi-cluster support and perhaps multi-cloud support? And that of course necessitates a more federated policy model, and it needs to provide the right abstractions with potentially room for optimizations as well. But you have to really think about where you want to go there. When we're talking about what happens in a cluster, we're talking about east-west traffic, and there are technologies for that, such as service mesh. But you also want to consider the round trip or basically the full trip from the requester through to the resources in the cluster and back. And that's where you want to look at, your north-south capabilities, which are handled in a Kubernetes world by ingress controllers. And you can you can repurpose or you can obtain load balancers for that purpose, ADCs and load balancers. Within the service mesh, of course, that's where you're dealing with the east-west traffic and the service-to-service communication. You'll have to think about what you want to do with the control plane and the data plane in those environments. You'll have to, of course, as part of a service mesh's functionality, has a range of functionality, but you have to look at discovery, connectivity, and communication. You may need load balancing features, traffic management, of course, observability I mentioned, and there are a range of security features that are available too. There's open source service meshes, as there are open source ingress controllers, and there are vendor provided offerings, many of which leverage open source as a foundation. And then you need to look at support for many environments today. Of course, there are very few enterprises who are going to start with a pure greenfield environment. They're going to have other applications running on other infrastructure, and you may have to consider, of course, how you move forward where you are today into this new container networking world, while continuing to have more of a centralized management capability for what you're also doing, what you've also done in the past and are carrying into the future. And then, as I said earlier, we can't forget about the lower layers of the stack. They also need to be capable of supporting these environments. And it's there that you'll have to look and ensure that your Ethernet data center switches have suitable API support and support CNI plugins for Kubernetes orchestration. So with that, I think we can move into the discussion. I know it may sound daunting what we've just mentioned, but we're going to get into this in a way that will be accessible and certainly compelling for the audience. Initially, we're going to talk about where we are today. where customers find themselves today. And of course, there's a broad spectrum of customers out there, but we'll talk about, more sophisticated customers and those who are just beginning the journey. So where are they with their networking for these cloud native environments, and what are they tackling first, and where are they going? And with that, I just want to once again introduce who we'll be speaking to on the panel today. We have Thomas Graf, co-founder and CEO of Isovalent. We have Galeal Zino, who's co-founder and CEO of NetFoundry. And last but not least, we have Pere Monclus, who is the VP and CTO networking for VMware. So let's move into the discussion, which is the first segment of the panel today, where we are currently, where customers find themselves in relation to networking for these cloud native environments. So we're going to move on to the questions, and I will queue it up for the audience. And I think we'll ask Thomas, first of all. Thomas, what are you seeing in terms of customer investments in modernizing their networks for these cloud native environments? How are they approaching the problem? Do they understand all of the implications as they move to these environments? Thomas?
Yes, hi, I'm Thomas Graf. Thanks a lot for hosting us, Brad, here. As mentioned in intro, I'm co-founder and CTO of Isovalent, also the creator of Cilium, which is one of the cloud native networking open source projects gaining popularity very quickly. As an example, Google Cloud has adopted Cilium as the solution for GK and Antus. We're also driving the networking, observability, and security needs of many, many customers across all verticals. We're backed by Andreessen Horowitz with Martin Casado as the partner, as well as Google Cloud and Cisco. Just as a quick background on who is speaking to you. So in terms of investments, yes, we are seeing a lot of investment into up-leveling the network to meet the unique environments or the unique requirements of cloud-native environments. Some of these needs are pretty obvious around scalability and performance. Not that long, and the number or the total number of container network ports worldwide will exceed the number of virtual ports in virtual machines, similar to how we've seen this from physical servers to virtual machines. But there are also other obvious transformations that need to happen. As an example, use of IP addresses is no longer a valid method of identification of workloads due to the ephemeral nature of containers. They are appearing and disappearing potentially within seconds. So including IP addresses in logs or audits and so on does not make any sense. So cloud native networking and all of the solutions that come with that need to understand service identities, service names, higher level constructs that are actually persistent. But then we're also seeing some of the more traditional requirements that are solutions that have been solved before: multi-cluster, multi-cloud, connecting physical data centers together with cloud environments, or even connecting more traditional workloads still running on virtual machines or on or even on metal machines with modern Kubernetes environments. For example, this big heavy database running on a metal server is probably not going to get migrated to a cloud-native environment very quickly. So this is another aspect that we are seeing investment in, not just building this new cloud-native network layer, but also the ability to actually connect to existing workloads as well.
Excellent. No, thank you very much, Thomas. And with that, I think Galeal from NetFoundry, I wonder if you could talk about what you're seeing in terms of the customers that you're engaging with right now.
Happy to, Brad. A little bit different take, actually. I wouldn't say our customers are looking to modernize their networks. I would say our customers are looking to eliminate their networks, right? And if you take it back to the problem they're trying to solve, really the same problem they're trying to solve with cloud. Our customers are trying to develop and deliver secure applications, but do it in a far more agile, extensible, high velocity manner than they were able to do on-prem. They need programmable secure application connections. Instead of, however, essentially moving the network to the cloud or modernizing the network, the challenge is more like, How do I get rid of the network? The network is a means to an end at the end of the day. The real end I need, and Thomas kind of alluded to this, is secure programmable application connections. That's where we believe our customers are moving, almost leapfrogging, if you will, not really moving the network to the cloud or modernizing the cloud, but eliminating the network.
So by abstracting it and programming it, you effectively make the network invisible. It's performing its goal, but you no longer have to concern yourself with it, right? As an entity.
Yeah, I mean, as you said in your intro, all the underlying infrastructure is still important. Just like in the cloud, there's a lot of underlying infrastructure that you're abstracted from. It's still important. But at the end of the day, if I want to securely and reliably deliver an application or service to my customer, I want to do that in a manner in which I'm focused on my customer experience and I'm touching the network, so to speak, as least as possible. I'm abstracting it. And in fact, Brad, and we'll get into this, we believe that actually has to be done in a zero trust manner, a secure by design manner. But I'm sure we'll get into that later in this conversation.
Absolutely. In fact, you've anticipated a follow-up question about how this changes the, who basically owns and runs the network infrastructure, as well as how they do it. So that is something we will discuss very shortly. But yeah, absolutely. And Pere, I wonder if you could give your perspective. I know at VMware you obviously see customers who have a lot of mixed environments. I wonder if you could give your perspective on how they're moving forward.
Definitely. My experience is more like Galeal. Is this notion that when you talk to customers that are thinking in terms of a cloud modern app transformation, they stop thinking in terms of the network as a standalone entity. It's not anymore the notion of compute, storage, and networking, and ports, and switches, and routers, and things like that, as you were mentioning before, Brad. And it's more like what Galeal is saying. It's like, as I choose an application platform to run my applications, how I run application resiliency, how do I have consistent security across multiple environments, how do I have on-demand elasticity of my applications, how do I bring SLOs and observability to my apps. So it's this notion that networking is not a standalone component, but rather is a top-down choice. And this is, sometimes we say that layer 7 or the upper layers of the stack are more important, but I think it's slightly different. It's more like networking is becoming a top-down concept, in a way that as you think in terms of what does my application need, the network needs to provide it. And I don't want to program a port or a switch or a router anymore. It needs to be part of the application platform. And within that, of course, there's the network and security that become almost one and the same, because I want to deploy secure, resilient apps on a multi-cloud environment. So that's one aspect. The second, in terms of customer interactions, you have different degrees of maturity within the customer pool. Sometimes it's driven by an architectural team that kind of are defining and designing the perfect architecture to run applications in a multi-cloud world. Sometimes the application developers have gone ahead and they're already using Kubernetes on a public cloud and they are just running their apps, and then the DevOps team need to figure out how to observe and understand what's going on. And sometimes it's driven by compliance requirements. For example, somebody says, oh, I have to enable end-to-end encryption. How do I look at technologies that give me that? But regardless of what's the starting point on the conversations, completely agree with Galeal that is automation, automation, automation. And how do I drive it kind of more from a DevOps, CI/CD point of view, not from networking as a standalone concept.
Absolutely. And it's interesting you mentioned that, and all of you mentioned a similar theme that, we've talked in the past, going back quite a few years, about making network more application-based or application-centric, but that was still, the way we did that was still very much kind of bottom-up approach. And now, Pere, what you're saying is, no, let's start with application constructs and, APIs and infrastructure as code and the way software, the way the applications are built and the way developers work, and use a top-down approach. And that's what you're talking about here. All of you are talking about here. And abstracting it and making it more intelligently automated. Yeah. Excellent. Now we get into a question that Galeal had anticipated. And this is about the network buying centers and infrastructure teams, how they're changing as we move into this environment. you know, we have platform teams, we have cloud architects, we have DevOps involved. We have groups that are not traditional networkers, and I'd love to get your perspective on how this changes not only the nature of network, you know, we talked about network architectures and infrastructure, but how it changes who does it, right? The operational model of networking and connectivity for cloud native environments. Galeal, I think given, you know, as you talked about zero trust and the kind of, you know, new security model in this world, as well as the connectivity model, I wonder if you could give your perspective first.
Sure, Brad. I think you hit the key term, actually, app-centric, and Thomas and Pere mentioned this as well. When the uber goal is to securely and reliably deliver an application, then we have to break down those silos, right? We end up with one unified team. And I agree, Brad, it includes different roles, DevOps, I'd add DevSecOps, NetOps, the architectures, the application folks, right? But they're working together because the reality is in today's world, right, of massively distributed applications, of the threats we're seeing out there, like the recent ransomware attacks, the only way to do this at scale with automation is to do it at code in a as built intentional manner. So we used to call it security as mandatory, so to speak, secure by design, zero trust. Brad, as you mentioned, simply put, there's no way to securely deliver applications in an agile, automated way without actually putting that code directly into the app from the start. And as you mentioned, Brad, that means all of those teams are working together for that purpose.
Absolutely. And Pere, I know you know you've spoken about this previously, how this is changing, and I wonder what your perspective is on your observations.
I see maybe see a lot of on-prem environments and then cloud environments, and I see that sometimes the relation is not as clean or as clear as it should be, right? The question of who owns networking goes tight in, very related to the thing of what is networking in this environment, right? And as we bring up resiliency, a traditional NetOps team on a 50-year enterprise with multinational sites and everything, does that person understands or feels that it's accountable for application resiliency? And a lot of times the answer is no, because networking traditionally in an on-prem environment has been defined in a different way. So what we are seeing is that there is this aspect of what is infra versus what is an app platform and versus what the developer and app owner expects from the components underneath. And to Galeal points, a lot of times all the roles should work together to achieve kind of this end-to-end networking experience from physical to virtual to service meshes to things like that. But what we are seeing is that in certain cases, you still have the traditional networking definition and then the application platform with the networking components. And that's all good, but sometimes it creates some tensions because, for example, the platform team may decide to pick a technology, something that you connect through a CNI interface and it provides connectivity for containers, but the networking team decides to go with a switch vendor that doesn't have support for those. And then you start having these frictions. In the cloud, it's less common. In the cloud, take into account that the cloud already provides some network substrate, and most of the modern apps with containers and Kubernetes and so on have been already designed to take benefit of those. Maybe there is smoothness, but we see this, the infra and the platform, and especially when we talk about security, a lot of evolution in terms of what does it mean to provide security into heterogeneous environments where you may have legacy and modern apps. But definitely there is a trend, as Galeal was saying, is that everybody starts to see networking as something that needs to converge and be easier to operate end-to-end with consistent policies and so on. But I would say there's still a lot of work to do to achieve kind of this perfect scenario where all the pieces of the network work together.
Yeah, absolutely. The simplification of those environments through the right abstractions and programmability is a daunting challenge because I guess in IT as well as networking, we rarely leave something completely behind, right? It's still with us, and we are moving forward at the same time. So there are a lot of different technologies that need to be encompassed and addressed. So it is a work in progress. And Thomas, I know, given the nature of the technologies that's foundational to your company, eBPF and Cilium, you go right into the kernel, so you may have a very interesting perspective on how this is changing not only the nature of networking, but who does it. And I'd love your perspective on this as well.
Absolutely. I think I've probably seen the opposite what Pere has been seeing. We have been seeing a lot of cloud first, cloud only customer interactions early on, where application teams may not even have been aware that a network existed. And the requirements and the asks were primarily around security, zero trust, least privilege, transparent encryption, MTLS, or tracing, visibility, troubleshooting ability. But the connectivity was there and was being taken care of by the cloud provider. And we've definitely also seen a variety of different combinations in terms of buying centers, depending a bit on how far along an enterprise is in this overall consolidation of SecOps, DevOps, DevSecOps. This is slightly different everywhere, but in the end, the overall theme that we're seeing is more and more is moving to the platform team, and the platform team is acting more and more as the central buying center, with requirements coming in from the security team, the app team. The app team might come in and say, hey, we need a service mesh-like functionality for tracing, for observability. The security team is coming in and saying, hey, we have PCI DSS requirements. Provide us with a network security solution that gives us the segmentation and the transparent encryption, all of that we need. But then the buying decision or the buying action is often done with the actual platform team. And there's one other aspect which I think is highly interesting. We've been working with a lot of cloud first companies since early on, and many of them are now on the path of also integrating and running on-prem as well. And they're now seeing the opposite. They're seeing they're used to having a cloud provider or multiple cloud providers provide the network, and all of a sudden on-prem, they now have to do some of this themselves. So we're almost coming from the opposite side sometimes, where all of a sudden we have to do BGP. All of a sudden it's about kind of integrating with, for example, a VMware NSX or similar. So we're also seeing that it's not always just on-prem physical to cloud and the network matters less. We also see some hugely successful companies that all of a sudden realize running on-prem is actually more cost efficient for us. And then they have to kind of bite the sour apple and kind of care about traditional networking as well again.
Yeah, and that is a challenge, right? Because to the greatest extent possible, those organizations that decide that have been cloud forward and cloud first, and they're now looking at on-prem, are trying to maintain consistency across those environments. So absolutely, yeah, makes sense. Thank you, by the way, all the panelists for those excellent responses. I think there were some tremendous insights for the audience. And now we're going to move on to the next segment of our discussion, which are the major challenges. And specifically, we want to look at exactly how these customers, and I know there's a spectrum of customers, there are the more, some, if we're looking at a spectrum, there are some that are inherently more cloud native than others. But we can talk about wherever you want to go in the spectrum in terms of the more sophisticated customers or those who are just starting. And I realize the challenges may be a bit different, but let's get into the questions. The first one is, what are enterprises' major challenges as they go on this journey, as they make these adjustments? And they are, quite significant depending on the organization. So I wonder, we'll start with Pere this time. Pere, you said earlier in your last segment that there are many different potential entry points for customers, right? Whether it's a security use case, whether it's connectivity use case, whether it's a visibility, observability use case. I wonder if you could talk about what you're seeing as the primary challenges that they're facing, or the use cases that they want to address.
Sometimes I like to summarize that the primary challenge is almost like what we call the path to production. I mean, we have lots of customers that are starting let's say, a bimodal approach, right? In the cloud, they start, as Thomas was mentioning, jump-starting a Kubernetes environment, putting some CAs, generating certificates, creating MTLS within this cloud environment. And suddenly they realize that they have to connect it end-to-end with whatever they have on-prem. And they have compliance and regulations that the CA, the certificate authority that generates the certificates in the cloud, is not the same as the one that they have on-prem. That the GSLB or the load balancer vendor that they have chosen is different in the cloud from on-prem. And now the application onboarding workflow is completely different. That the security posture that they have in the cloud may be more like zero trust style, like kind of starting by the edge, putting the right API security into an encryption and so on. On-prem, they may have a more traditional perimeter-based model with legacy firewalls. And now you have to bring all these pieces together. So a lot of the work we do with the portfolio of products that we do and we have is essentially enable this, what we call path to production, on how to start smoothing out, as you said, the observability across heterogeneous environments, the policies across heterogeneous environments, the connectivity, and always going back to what we were saying before, thinking that at the end of the day, this is how to provide application resiliency between multiple clouds. And maybe that demands multi-cluster or multi-cloud connectivity and security, how to provide consistent SLO monitoring, and this requires the observability elements and so on. But I would say a lot of customers, they start kind of bottoms up, picking the technology components, and then they realize that they have created 2 or 3 parallel stacks. And then the journey towards productizing the whole thing end-to-end becomes this the most challenging aspect that we are seeing in terms of mature companies. To Thomas' point, a lot of new companies, kind of like the more cloud-centric companies, like the Leaves and the Ubers of the world and so on, they have started already with kind of a modern architecture in place. Those tend to be easier because, as Thomas was mentioning, is you start kind of with a modern architecture, you don't have legacy, and then you just take it on-prem or on the cloud or across geographies. That tends to be a bit easier, but then you have the more traditional large enterprises that they may not have that luxury and they have to productize the whole thing with an end-to-end architecture. And that's where we see a lot of work going on right now in order to be able to catch up and be as fast as the new companies are being in the digital world.
Absolutely. No, it's those are excellent observations. And Thomas, I wonder, you know, it Pere kind of referred to you as he was speaking. I wonder if you could pick up the thread and talk about, I realize you are dealing with a lot of digital natives. That's probably, those are I don't want to presume, but I imagine that that's a significant part of your customer base early on for your company. But I wonder if you could provide your take on this in terms of what you're
First of all, I 100% agree with what Pere just said. And we've definitely had a heavy focus on early on digital natives, but now we're also driving financials. We're now seeing both. And I agree completely. The major challenge, in particular for the more traditional enterprises, is not being able to move the overall transformation to cloud native quickly enough. Because even though a platform team might be ready and willing to go as quickly as possible, the internal guardrails in terms of compliance requirements, security teams imposing rules, they haven't really changed yet. And they're still tailored to the existing world. Some of them are not even tailored to the virtualization world yet. They're even pre-virtualization era. That is a major challenge. That often requires that these cloud native solutions that have been developed in this green field of cloud native only, now all of a sudden have to integrate with boring enterprise systems, right? Whether that's an SIEM provider, whether it's a visibility system, whether that's a very old IDS system that is still operating on the packet level and is expecting tap mirror functionality. So we have been spending a good portion of our time doing exactly this and enabling enterprises to benefit from this new pure cloud native simplicity. And I agree, it's like the first statements that were made. Ideally, the network is not even visible. You want to benefit from it with increased security, increased visibility, but ideally you don't even see it's there. And ideally you never have to even troubleshoot it. But sometimes you still have to, but in the end, I think what matters is the actual integration. A second big challenge that we see is that some enterprises are struggling to deal with the complexity of some of these new solutions. I think the most prominent one that I think most people have heard about is service mesh. I think it brings a lot of amazing, great values, and application teams usually jump on right away. The implementation, as we see it right now, is unnecessarily complex. So we have been very successful at providing those same values that a service mesh offers, but with simplicity, and maybe with slightly reduced feature set, right? That maybe a typical enterprise does not need the same set of features as a true cloud native or cloud native first. But to strike this right balance between complexity and feature set is I think something that is important as well. Not everybody can adopt technology quite as quick as the really early on cloud native players.
Yeah, and that's a great point you make, right? Everybody wants simplicity, and we certainly saw that the early implementations of service mesh were perceived as very complex by a large number of organizations. But as we move towards simplifying these technologies, we also have to ensure that simplification does not necessarily mean a dumbing down or a diminution of capabilities, right? It's a significant challenge because some customers will want that feature richness and extensibility in whatever they get. So it's a great point. Galeal, I know you talked earlier about zero trust, and you talked earlier about making the network invisible. I wonder if you could give your perspective on this.
Yeah, 2 quick points. First of all, it's the journey. And I think all 3 of our companies are very focused on helping customers with the journey because it is the most difficult aspect. Listen, it's not just technology, right? It's people, processes, cultures, organizations. Like those things don't change overnight. We're in the DocuSign era. And in the last 2 weeks, I've had to do several wet signatures and faxes. And I'm thinking, really? But hey, that's reality, right? It's a journey. But the second point, Brad, and I think the exciting point, the destination, the opportunity is really, really interesting. I mean, what we're headed to is a world of distributed compute, right? Processing workloads across a spectrum of compute from far edge all the way to cloud. And historically, we've kind of been in this unenviable position of having to choose between either really strong security over here and agility and automation and business velocity over here. Done right, this destination that we're all talking about, right? This is not having to make that compromise. This is doing everything as code, abstracting away from the security and networking infrastructure, and actually being able to not make a choice between, let's say, security and agility, but have both as programmable constructs. That's a really exciting destination to go towards, Brad, even though the journey is going to be difficult.
Absolutely. In the past, there had always been this almost showdown between control, and as you said, control represented by things like security and agility, right? In terms of going at the speed of business, going at the speed of digital business, and it was seen as a sort of zero-sum game, right? You couldn't necessarily go all the way with one without sacrificing the other, and you're right, there is an opportunity here to address both equally and to be able to reconcile those. So it's a great point. And I think the other question we wanted to address here is we talked about the challenges, and I wonder if we could talk about how they're addressing them, and also as part of that, how enterprises are trying to strike the right balance between doing it themselves, creating themselves using open source technologies, and buying. I'm curious as to what all of you are seeing, because of course, open source technologies are extremely prevalent in the cloud native world, and we're seeing many network projects, and some of you, of course, are very involved with them. Many networking open source projects are proliferating in this space in cloud native. So I wonder if you could talk about how specifically customers are, what sort of solutions are they finding? Where are they getting these things? I guess they're getting them for your organizations, of course. But I want to talk about how they're finding a balance. Are some starting with open source and saying, well, you know what, open source is helping me, but I need a little more help, and I want to reach out to a vendor, or are they going to the vendor first and saying, look, you know, I want something that's going to be curated and value add. Can you help me? Can you help me do that? I wonder if you guys could give your perspective on that, and we'll start again with Thomas and work to Galeal and Pere.
Yes, I think we are seeing everything from I want to only build to the point of almost having a policy we're not buying anything. We've even seen end user driven cloud native projects where the actual full project and solution has been almost entirely developed by an end user or a set of end users. And sometimes this has worked really great. There are several examples of for example, CNCF projects which have been entirely driven by end users. We're also seeing customers that come with I'm used to buying, please allow me to buy. We're also sometimes seeing a mix. To me, what connects it all together is the open source component. So the reusability, forming a community and benefiting from each other. I think there are many forms where this can work. It can be an entirely end user driven open source project, but the model that we see more frequently and more successful is when customers find a way to successfully work with cloud native vendors together and buy, but also gain influence into the forward, into the future development of the product. Cloud native is still a very, very young market. So there's still ample possibility and opportunity for customers to influence and drive the product forward. That's been our approach to developing our solutions forward and has been highly successful, and I think been a win-win for both customers and also for us as a vendor.
Excellent, excellent. Galeal, I welcome your perspective.
Yeah, I agree. And I would add that they're not mutually exclusive approaches at all. They're very complementary and supplementary. If I take NetFoundry customers as an example, they're leveraging both our open source, which we've open sourced our underlying platform, as well as our SaaS services, right? Now, the SaaS services are more like turnkey zero trust, like let me be able to embed zero trust into my application without having to develop myself the identity functions, the authentication, the authorization, the least privileged access, the microsegmentation, blah, 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 right? Let me take that as a turnkey SaaS service. However, at the same time, if I'm going to put your code, like NetFoundry's code or any vendor, if I'm going to put that code in my code, and I'm going to enable that, I'm going to make that part of my application so that it's natively cloud native, it's natively zero trust. Well, I want the assurances that the underlying code is open source, right? I may need to branch it. I may need to fork it. I may need to do something custom for my specific customers. I need that flexibility of the open source. I want to take advantage of the community innovation on top of that open source. And even in the scenario of, well, what happens if the company providing these SaaS services, it goes away, it gets acquired, whatever? Well, they have the open source. So interestingly, Brad, more and more we see the open source and the turnkey SaaS services is actually very complementary.
Yeah, and what you said is absolutely critical as we move. I mean, it's been true previously, but it's never been truer that organizations and enterprises are ensuring that they have choice, they have options, and they have flexibility as they move forward, right? And I think you've addressed that point extremely well just now. Pere, I know from VMware, you'll have a perspective on this as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think open source has transformed the industry in a major manner, in the sense that imagine that you were a developer like 10, 15 years ago, and you wanted to develop something from your home based on the current situations where we all live, and you didn't have access to a very expensive application server, I don't know, a Java-based application server that costs tens of thousands of dollars, right? What could you do? And the notion of that I could write my app, but I could never experience my app in the way that it would run in production. And suddenly with open source, with the advent of Kubernetes and all the components associated to Kubernetes and application frameworks on top of that, Knative and so on, and PCF. So now a developer has the ability to run in an automated fashion out of a CI/CD pipeline something in a laptop that potentially looks and feels and smells the same way that it's going to run on a native public cloud or an on-prem environment, and have exactly the same policies, the same configuration, the same network characteristics as you would have in production. And that is huge, because if you remember, going back to this notion of how to become agile as an organization, before I was a developer, I would write my code, I would compile something, but the notion of creating an application and how to embed a certificate and how to request a subnet and how to do all these things were through ticketing systems that would take like weeks, if not months, right? So I would say open source has allowed developers to have these sandboxes that now they can experience the same thing that is going to run in production, and that's great. Now, at the same time, what happens is that in order to move it to production, the open source components may need support. And now this may be because I have the ability to hire talent in my organization to provide that support internally, maybe because I may be able to consume it as a service in a way that I don't have to do that support myself, or maybe because I pay somebody to provide a solution for me with all the pieces together. But I would say this relation on how the open source and the vendors and the vendor offerings interface together to essentially bring to enterprises what Galeal was saying in terms of security, or what Thomas was saying before in terms of consistency or integration or whatever it may be. Let's remember that the biggest contribution, I would say, is this notion that now developers can develop in an agile manner that before was not possible. And we, the three of us and the rest of the industry together here as vendors, we are here to support enterprises in this transformation to become more agile, more secure in whatever environment they might want to do. And again, the consumption model may be self-consumption, maybe SaaS, maybe on-prem, but essentially it has changed the way we understand DevOps, application development, and infrastructure.
Excellent. No, thank you very much. And now we're going to move to the third segment of the discussion. And this is where our panelists, and I know the audience is very interested in this. Some of them may know your organizations, but not necessarily know your solutions. And some folks out in the audience may not even know about your companies or know little about your companies and also have limited knowledge about your solutions. But we've talked about the challenges, we've talked about where enterprises are today, and now you have an opportunity to talk about what you're doing to help these customers, what solutions you're bringing to market, and what problems each of you is solving with those solutions. So with that, I'd like to start with Galeal. Galeal, I wonder if you could talk a bit about what you're doing at NetFoundry to address the challenges that were mentioned earlier and to help customers as they move along this journey.
Sure, Brad. First of all, as mentioned, making sure that our customers don't need to choose between security and agility. Right? That's fundamentally the most important problem they have. It's an opportunity in that if they can have both agility and security, then they can win as a business. Two key points, Brad. One, this is a long journey as we articulated. I would just add a little bit more detail there. We believe that this journey goes both ways. We believe there's a lot of things the enterprise or the business needs to do. We also believe there's a lot of things the application developers, the ISVs, the SaaS providers, the MSPs, we believe that there's a lot they need to do as well. And an easy example or a relatively simple example, SSL or TLS, right? I don't know how many years ago, Brad and team, that some percentage of the SaaS apps we use, of the web pages we went to, they were not SSL TLS, right? They're HTTP, right? Now, thanks partially to what Chrome and Firefox and others have done, right? That doesn't exist, and no enterprise is going to buy a SaaS app that's not delivered over TLS. Well, the SaaS provider in that case, they did that, right? They're embedding TLS or SSL into their app, right? It's table stakes for security. It doesn't mean the enterprise isn't doing things. They're doing some things too, proxies and IPS, IDS, and SWIG and everything else they do, right? But the point is that the developer also took a step. Well, I think within a few years, the next major step that these developers are going to take, these MSPs who are managing networks are going to take, they're going to embed zero trust into their applications and services in the same way that, for example, TLS or SSL is embedded today. And that's really, Brad, where we focus, is enabling a simple way for those developers to embed zero trust as code so that by definition, it fits into their DevOps, DevSecOps, NetOps, automation, and agility. And quite frankly, helps give their customer the assurance that they're not going to be the next ransomware conduit, that they're doing everything possible as an IC or MSP to make sure that their particular application and service is not the next ransomware conduit. We think that's really important to our customers, Brad, so that's where we focus.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And of course, we all know ransomware has been very much in the news lately. Pere, I wonder if you could speak specifically about your solutions. And I do know that, I talked earlier about the continuum from, north-south to east-west in these environments. And I know you address both of them, and you have other solutions as well. So I wonder if you could talk about what you're doing in this space.
Yeah, I mean, VMware is a large company, and of course, we have a variety of products. It's not one product, it's a portfolio. On the aspect of modern apps and application development on Kubernetes, we have kind of a two-way approach. One is, of course, thinking in terms of a full application platform. That's what we call the Tanzu platform. And in there, you have the Kubernetes runtime, you have the service mesh, you have the CNI with the network virtualization, you have the ingress with the load balancer and the WAF capabilities, and with IPS, ADS, and so on. And then you have, to Galeal's point, this aspect of integrated security within the application lifecycle, what we call the build, run, manage. And a lot of times we think in terms of security as network security, but what about container scanning and secure repositories and endpoint and detection and response and all those elements? So from a VMware point of view, we have a platform that delivers all these things as SaaS, as an on-prem. Then at the same time, we have a set of components, the components that I mentioned, for example, the ingress controller with the NSX Advanced Load Balancer, which comes out of the Avi acquisition that we did a couple of years ago. And it provides a multi-cloud scale out with high performance on TLS, with WAF capabilities and so on for Kubernetes on any cloud. On the service mesh side, the service mesh that we have, it provides service mesh capabilities across any Kubernetes environment, including the public clouds. On the network virtualization, we have an open source project called Andrea that is being deployed in cloud environments, and then we have NSX on-prem, and we are integrating the two together in a way that the policies are consistent end to end. So again, VMware, large company, helping large and small and medium enterprises to transition to this cloud native and modern app transformation, and as Gale was mentioning, in a secure manner, and approaching it in two ways, kind of as a platform transformation or as a component transformation, depending on the problem that the customer may have, and addressing it both ways. And with a strong spin of offering the products and services as SaaS and on-prem, with on-prem licenses, where VMware traditionally has been more considered to be an on-prem license model, but now with a big push all the way top down to the company through this SaaS transformation, where now most of the VMware services are being consumed by as SaaS.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Pere. And I know Thomas, obviously with eBPF and Cilium, I wonder if you could give your perspective on this. And I'm sure the audience, maybe some of the audience is not familiar yet with your company, but I wonder if you could talk a bit about your solutions and how you're solving these problems.
Absolutely, Brad. Yes, so we have created the Cilium project, which is an open source project. Isovalent is the company behind it. And in terms of simplicity, I think Pere actually said this very, very well. The overall goal is for application teams to have the same user experience, whether they deploy it to a local laptop or to a multi-cluster Kubernetes environment at massive scale. From a user experience, it should be the same. Networking should not be an added complexity to do this. And in order to kind of implement and provide this, there is a lot of requirements that come up. From a networking perspective, we are providing we call it a universal network plane that works exactly the same across cloud providers, whether you're in the cloud or on-prem. We're decoupling that and adding a connectivity layer on top. Very similar to a service mesh, but we're implementing this at the low latency and at the efficiency of a network solution, thanks to the help of eBPF. But even more important are additional security requirements that have been mentioned over and over in these discussions. It's zero trust, it's least privilege, it's portable network policies. So being able to run the same network policies in a Google Cloud or in an Amazon cloud. They should not depend on underlying infrastructure. It's the ability to, for example, transparently encrypt seamlessly. It's the ability to understand service identities instead of talking about network endpoints. But also from a overall observability perspective, the need for observability has gone well beyond what network-based observability solutions have been provided so far. So we are offering observability for application teams, platform teams, and security teams. And we won't just stop at the network level. We can actually, for example, go deeper and even understand what are the processes doing inside of a container, like which individual process has done what on the actual network level. That's the level of granularity, that's the level of visibility that the security team demands these days. It's not enough just to think about layers. I think this was mentioned really, really well in the very beginning. In the end, we're now building a connectivity platform that should be invisible, but needs to provide values that are actually quite difficult to implement. It needs to be multi-cloud, needs to be on-prem and cloud. Application teams will consume part of it. Application teams want to see, for example, tracing values. How well is my app performing? They're asking the network how fast their app is actually responding to a user request, and so on. So we're building this next generation networking layer that meets the demands in terms of networking, security, and observability. Some people call this SDN 2.0. Others are calling this service mesh. Others just call it cloud-native networking. Others call it cloud networking. In the end, I think we will have this new networking layer that operates natively on a cloud level that can also integrate with on-prem workloads.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Thomas. I'm going to give each of you a chance to summarize in a minute as part of a roundup what you feel is the most salient takeaway for the audience today, and we'll start with Pere. Pere, I wonder if you could summarize. If there was one message you want to leave the audience with, what would that be?
Yeah, the message would be this notion that networking is changing. It's not anymore a bottoms-up construct. It's a top-down concept. Needs to be considered from the platform design from the beginning. And it cannot be an afterthought because you cannot embed application resiliency, security, observability after the fact. So the network is a fundamental component of your platform. And if you don't do it right on your path to production, you're going to find quite a bit of issues. So always think that the modern network is part of your modern app. And without bringing the two of them together at the same level, you will not get the resiliency or the security or the multi-cloud experience that you expect, and you have to think it up front.
Excellent. Thank you. Thomas, what is your takeaway for the audience today?
I think the most important aspect is to understand that cloud native strategy is a journey, and customers will be at various points, and it's our job, it's our purpose, it's our responsibility to work with customers to help them along the path. There are obviously technologies involved, but in the end, it's about working closely with the customers to enable them step by step. Each of them may have slightly different needs, and it's important to actually really focus on that. I think that will drive both the cloud native world forward in meeting the future needs, but it will also drive the individual customers forward as well.
Excellent, thank you. And Galeal, you can take us home.
We see this quite simply as the last step in software eats world. Like we talk about software eats world, but software didn't eat networking, not yet. Software didn't eat security, not yet. And therefore, we're not yet prepared for a world of distributed compute, secure by design, containerized applications, moving at ML or AI speed. We're just not, right? Tomorrow's requirements, the way businesses win tomorrow is just fundamentally different than the way they win today or yesterday. And so it's not really a matter of modernizing the network or iterative change or replicating what we did yesterday and putting it in the cloud. It's more a matter of fundamentally looking at the business challenge at hand. Where's our North Star? Where's the destination? And then, as Thomas and Pere said, how do we proceed on that journey in an iterative way? How do we serve our customers with excellence now while we proceed along that journey to that North Star destination?
Excellent. Yeah, and of course that's a departure, and I think all three of you mentioned it earlier from the way things were done in the previous era, right? Way back in the client server, where you had a platform and then you had to figure out what you could do with it. Now we're looking at it from basically allowing our business objectives and our outcomes to drive what we do, and it's a top-down approach. I think that's excellent. I want to thank the panelists and thank the audience for being here today. And given that we still have questions in the queue, I certainly want to applaud our panelists, because they've managed to live up to the show business objective of leave them wanting more. So thank you very much, panelists, for your participation today and the great insights that you've provided.